Today, we're diving into what might be one of the most fascinating political showdowns in modern Canadian history. This isn't just about two different politicians. It's about two completely different, opposing ways of seeing the world. This is Mark Carney versus Pierre Poilievre.
So let's set the stage. Picture this. It's January 2025. The country's been through nearly a decade of pretty sluggish economic growth. Canada's ranked almost dead last among 38 developed nations. And with that as the backdrop, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau steps down.
Now you'd think the path would be wide open for Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. He's way ahead in the polls. But then, something nobody saw coming happens. On March 14th, Mark Carney, a guy who's run two of the world's most important central banks, is sworn in as Canada's new Prime Minister. And almost immediately, he calls an election, basically turning what looked like a sure thing into a complete toss-up.
And it's pretty wild just how much things changed, and how fast. Before Carney jumped in, the Conservatives had this massive lead. Afterwards, the whole race became a statistical dead heat. So this really sets the stage for our showdown, the insider versus the outsider.
Okay, let's get into it. And we'll start with the man who came straight from the top tiers of global finance to run the country, Mark Carney.
Carney's resume almost reads like it was written in a lab to create a global leader. He was raised in Edmonton by two educators, and he showed this interest in public policy really early on. He was even writing letters to the newspaper as a teenager defending progressive taxes. His education was top-notch, Harvard then Oxford. From there, it was a high-flying career at Goldman Sachs until he stepped into public service in 2008 as the governor of the Bank of Canada.
And this is really where the Carney legend begins. There's this popular story, one you'd hear from people like Jon Stewart, that it was Carney's quick, smart decisions that saved Canada from the absolute chaos of the 2008 financial crisis. But is that the whole picture?
Well, a study from some prominent economists suggests maybe not. They argue that Canada was already in a uniquely strong position. We had a really stable banking system, a pre-conservative mortgage market, and we didn't have a big shadow banking sector, those unregulated lenders. But the big thing? The government had run 12 straight years of surpluses. We were in an incredibly strong financial position, which gave us the room to spend our way through the crisis without breaking the bank.
After his job in Canada, Carney took on an even bigger role, governor of the Bank of England, right in the middle of all the Brexit turmoil. And he got a reputation for being very vocal, very strong-willed, which was a big change from the quiet, reserved governors before him. This quote from The Guardian kind of sums up the reputation he built. Brilliant and confident for sure, but also difficult and commanding.
Now, after leaving public service, Carney didn't just fade away. He dove right back into the private sector, and on a massive scale. He became the chair of Brookfield Asset Management, a global giant that manages over $900 billion in assets.
And his personal financial connection to all this is pretty deep. His stock options in Brookfield alone are currently worth around $5 million. And of course, those could be worth way more if the company's stock keeps climbing.
But that's not all. He was also in line for something called carried interest, which is basically a cut of the profits from investments in two funds that had a combined $25 billion of capital. We're talking about a potential personal payday that could easily be in the tens, maybe even hundreds of millions of dollars.
So you can see why this has become a sticking point. All these deep financial ties have led to a lot of questions about potential conflicts of interest. When reporters have pushed him on it, Carney has tended to get defensive, saying he's put his assets in a blind trust and that he's just following the rules. But for his critics, that's not good enough, and it leaves voters heading to the polls without really knowing the full extent of his financial entanglements.
All right, now let's completely shift gears and turn to his opponent, a man who in almost every way is his polar opposite, Pierre Poilievre, the populist outsider.
Poilievre's story couldn't be more different from Carney's. He was adopted by a couple of school teachers in Calgary, and that more modest upbringing really shaped his skepticism of big government. He got into politics super early, joining the Reform Party when he was just 14, and finding an intellectual hero in the free market guru Milton Friedman.
His ambition was always crystal clear, and his rise was incredibly fast. He started as a political advisor, but at just 25, he decided to run for office himself. He went up against a two-term incumbent, won, and became the youngest member of parliament. He definitely caught the attention of then Prime Minister Stephen Harper right away.
But here's where we get to the central paradox of Pierre Poilievre.
Here's a man who champions the private sector and talks constantly about limited government, yet his entire adult life, his entire career, has been paid for by the taxpayer. He's a career politician who's built his entire brand on hating the very political class that he's a part of.
He really became a national figure, though. As the shadow minister for finance, he built this reputation for being incredibly sharp, super quick on his feet, and just relentless in his attacks on the Trudeau government's spending, its money printing, and especially its carbon tax. But that political strategy also came with some risks. The more he leaned into populist messages, going on controversial podcasts, promoting things like Bitcoin, the more the comparisons to Donald Trump started to stick. And for a lot of Canadian voters, that started to feel like a pretty serious liability.
So, this all brings us back to the choice facing the country, a choice between two very different leaders. And interestingly, each of them comes with their own big set of contradictions.
When you lay it all out, the divide is just so clear. You've got Carney, the ultimate insider, the technocrat who believes that smart experts can solve problems from within the existing system. And then you've got Poilievre, the ultimate outsider, the populist who wants to rally the people against that very same system.
So in the end, the conflict really boils down to this: a top-down technocrat who trusts and really seems to admire the global system as it is, versus a populist who, at his core, despises it. It's a reformer trying to work from the inside versus a critic trying to tear things down from the outside. And that leaves us all with one final, very tricky question. Is the real choice for Canada between an insider who stands to personally profit big time from the very system he says he wants to reform, or an outsider who has built his entire career and made his living inside the very system he says he wants to dismantle?